What you want to say about the baby?
Good time, baby.
Alright guys, I need you to take a good look at your screen right here. We need to bring this 4-year-old baby home. This is Javeayah Harris, and she is from Aiken County, South Carolina. And according to authorities, they say that she was last seen at her home in the area of Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road at around 8:15 p.m. on Tuesday. There has been boots on the ground to try to find this little girl. Local authorities and now the FBI are involved, and they are hoping that they can find this little girl. I really hope and pray that she is found safe. I want to stay optimistic. We need to stay optimistic. And this is what Javeayah looks like. Please take a good look at your screen, especially if you live in the South Carolina area.
Sharon, you've been charged with homicide by child abuse. You understand that charge?
Yes, sir.
You understand that if convicted, it carries up 20 years to life in prison? You
Yes, sir.
understand that? You've also been charged with filing false police report of a felony violation. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
It carries up to 5 years in prison or a $5,000 fine. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you want to see if you qualify for a court-appointed attorney, or are you going to retain the services? Are you going to retain the services of your own legal counsel?
I can get public assistance.
Okay. So answer a couple of questions for me. Are you employed?
Yes, sir.
And where do you work?
Transcom.
Transcom?
Yes, sir.
Do you get paid weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly?
Bi-weekly.
And on average, what do you typically bring home every 2 weeks?
1,300.
Anybody else live in the household with you?
Yes, sir. Father.
So just one?
Yes, sir.
Does he do anything to contribute to the financial status of the home?
He work at DHL.
There's a moment in every one of these cases where a phone gets picked up, a number gets dialed, and somebody starts talking. And here's the thing about that moment, it's almost never about what actually happened. It's about what the person on the other end of the call needs you to believe happened. On the night of June 30th, in a quiet stretch of Aiken County, South Carolina, a woman named Michilae made a call like that. She told 911 dispatchers her 4-year-old daughter had wandered off while playing near the family's chicken coop. 45 minutes, she said. That's how long Javeayah had been out of sight. A little girl, out back with the chickens, gone. Within hours, that single phone call had turned into one of the largest search operations Aiken County had seen in years. Deputies, firefighters, emergency responders, and it kept growing. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, the Department of Natural Resources, the Forestry Commission, neighboring fire departments, and eventually the FBI, sending in agents from their Columbia field office along with specialized units, the kind you don't call in for a routine case. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. A helicopter went up, drones went out, cadaver dogs worked the property and the woods around it. More than 200 people at points were looking for one little girl. And that's usually where I tell you the story bends toward hope. A community rallying, a family desperate, a county holding its breath. That's the story everyone wanted to believe for 4 straight days. But here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. What does it say about a story when the people who started it are the only 2 people who know it isn't true? Because that's exactly what investigators would eventually conclude. The 2 people who reported Javeayah missing, who stood by while search teams tore through thousands of acres of South Carolina woodland, who accepted casseroles and prayers and the sympathy of an entire county. They knew, according to authorities, that there was nothing to find in those woods. Not because someone had taken her, because she was already gone and had been for weeks. Let's talk about who we're actually dealing with here. Johmarea Harris, 23 years old. Michilae, 22. Javeayah's father and mother. Young parents, by most accounts unremarkable to their neighbors, the kind of couple you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. That's not a throwaway detail. It's the whole point. Monsters in these stories rarely look like monsters walking around beforehand. They look like a young mom carrying a toddler on her hip. They look like a dad waving at a neighbor. Aiken County didn't have a criminal legend living among them that everyone quietly suspected. They had two 20-somethings raising a little girl in a house near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, doing whatever it is young parents do until, according to investigators, something happened behind that door that nobody outside of it was ever supposed to know about. So let's go back, before the 911 call, before the search teams, before Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood at a podium and delivered what he'd later call the hardest announcement of his 36-year career. Let's go back to when Javeayah Harris was just a 4-year-old girl living an ordinary life that nobody was watching closely enough. We don't know a lot about her day to day. That's one of the quieter tragedies. Buried inside a case like this, the victim becomes a name attached to warrants and press conferences before she ever gets to be a person with a favorite cartoon or a way she liked her hair done. What we do know is where she lived, a home in Aiken County near a chicken coop her mother would later use as the backdrop for a story that never happened. We know her full name, Javeayah Harris, the kind of detail reporters dig up only after a case turns dark enough to need a full identification. We know she was young enough to still be at that age where a parent is supposed to be the entire structure of your world. The one who feeds you, the one who notices when something's wrong, the one who picks up the phone the second something bad happens. And this is where the background of this case stops being about a missing child and starts being about a failure that had been unfolding for weeks before anyone called it a crime. Because according to arrest warrants, Javeayah didn't simply disappear on June 30th. She'd suffered an injury during an alleged assault well before that date, an injury serious enough that, under any normal set of circumstances, a parent picks up the phone, drives to an emergency room, does literally anything other than nothing. That's the background you need sitting in your head before we go any further, because it reframes everything that comes after it. This was never a story about a missing 4-year-old. It was a story about a household where something had already gone catastrophically wrong, dressed up deliberately, according to investigators, to look like an accident of the outside world. Not a failure inside the home, not a decision made by the two adults responsible for keeping her safe. Just bad luck. A kid, some chickens, an unfenced yard, and 45 unsupervised minutes. Keep that image in your head. A little girl playing by a chicken coop at 8 o'clock at night. Because as we move forward into what investigators say actually happened in the weeks leading up to that 911 call, you're going to want to ask yourself the same question Aiken County Sheriff's investigators eventually had to ask. If this story was true, why did the timeline never add up? Here's what investigators say happened next, and it's the part of this case that turns from tragic to disturbing in about 10 seconds flat. There was no elaborate scheme here, no burner phones, no fake alibi rehearsed for weeks, no criminal mastermind plotting an escape route. What warrants describe instead is something far more mundane and, honestly, far harder to stomach. A decision made once and then made again every single day after, simply by doing nothing. Javeayah suffered an injury during what investigators allege was an assault. The warrants point to Herring's involvement in that assault specifically. And in the aftermath of that injury, the plan, if you want to call it that, wasn't sophisticated at all. It was silence. No hospital, no urgent care, no call to a pediatrician's after-hours line, nothing that would put a paper trail anywhere near what had happened inside that house. Think about how low that bar is. You don't need a criminal genius to drive to an emergency room. You don't need a strategy session to dial 3 digits. The planning in this case, if it deserves that word at all, was really just the absence of the one obvious thing any responsible adult does on instinct: get the kid help. And according to investigators, that absence wasn't a single lapse in judgment made in a panic. It was sustained. Day after day, the option to make things right sat right there, untaken. So let's walk through what execution looks like when the crime isn't really an event, but an ongoing failure. Javeayah, hurt in a home with 2 people who, whether out of fear of what a hospital visit would reveal, fear of the consequences, or something colder than fear, chose not to act. We don't know exactly what her days looked like in that window. What we know is what didn't happen. No medical intervention, no outside adult stepping in, no 911 call for the actual emergency happening in real time. The system that's supposed to catch a child in danger, teachers, doctors, extended family, neighbors never got the chance to catch her because the two people closest to her made sure nobody outside that house ever knew there was anything to catch. Here's where it gets worse, and I want you to sit with this next part because it's the hinge the entire case turns on. According to Sheriff Marty Sawyer, Javeayah had been deceased for at least a month by the time that 911 call came in on June 30th. Read that again. A full month. Do the math on what that means. It means somewhere in that stretch of untreated injury, of silence, of two adults choosing not to get help, Javeayah died. And whatever happened in the moments around her death, whatever finally went wrong, badly enough that a 4-year-old girl didn't survive it, her parents didn't call anyone then either. What they did instead, according to investigators, was decide what to do with her body. And this is the detail that turns your stomach in a specific way, because it requires a level of cold, functioning decision-making that stands in total contrast to the "we just didn't know what to do" defense that so often gets floated in cases like this. You don't accidentally end up disposing of a body outside your own county. That takes a vehicle. It takes a destination. It takes driving deliberately, with intent somewhere far enough from home that discovery becomes less likely. Investigators would later focus their search efforts outside Aiken County altogether, looking in areas tied to Fairfield and Chester counties, well over an hour from where Javeayah lived. That's not panic, that's logistics. And this is the part where the escalation in this case stops being about what happened to Javeayah and starts being about what her parents were willing to do to protect themselves. They went back to living their lives. For weeks. Knowing what they knew, having done what they'd done, Johmarea Harris and Michilae Herring continued on in that house near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, as if nothing underneath their daily routine had fundamentally changed. Neighbors saw them, family saw them. Nobody had any reason to suspect that the little girl who should have been part of their household simply wasn't there anymore. Which raises the question I think anyone watching this has to ask themselves at this point. What does it take to maintain a lie like that? Not for a day, not for a week, for roughly a month before the story even needed to exist yet, and then once June 30th arrived, for 4 more days on top of that, under the glare of FBI agents, cadaver dogs, and a sheriff standing in front of television cameras every single day, giving updates on a search for a child both parents already knew, according to authorities, was never coming home. Because here's the thing about escalation in a case like this, it's not one big dramatic choice. It's a series of smaller ones, each slightly worse than the last, each one requiring the people involved to double down instead of turning back. Don't call for help when she's hurt. Don't call anyone when she dies. Drive her somewhere far from home. Go back to normal life. And then, weeks later, when questions start to arise about where Javeayah actually is, don't tell the truth then either. Instead, invent a story simple enough to be believable and vague enough to survive a first round of questioning a kid. Some chickens, a yard, 45 unsupervised minutes. That story held up for exactly as long as it took investigators to start pulling at its threads. And in the next part, that's exactly what we're going to watch happen the moment a search for a missing little girl quietly turned into an investigation of the 2 people who reported her missing in the first place. For 4 days, the official story out of Aiken County was one of hope holding on by a thread. Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood in front of cameras and talked about bringing Javeayah home. The FBI's Kevin Moore, special agent in charge out of the Columbia field office, talked about dozens of agents, about neighborhood canvassing, about digital media review, about the behavioral analysis unit and the child abduction rapid deployment team working the case. 200 first responders, a helicopter overhead, drones combing terrain too dense for boots on the ground, cadaver dogs working the property and the surrounding woods. This was not a token effort. This was the kind of full-scale mobilization that happens when a community and its law enforcement agencies genuinely believe there's still a chance to save a child. And that's exactly what makes the mistake at the center of this case so glaring in hindsight. Because the story Michilae Herring told the little girl playing near the chicken coop, out of sight for 45 minutes before anyone noticed, was built to survive a quick glance. It was not built to survive 4 days of forensic scrutiny from an FBI behavioral analysis unit whose entire job is picking apart exactly this kind of narrative. Here's a question worth asking. When you tell a lie that big, how long do you actually think it'll hold? Because the mistake investigators say Herring and Harris made wasn't some single dramatic misstep. It was the same miscalculation almost every offender in this genre makes. They assumed that once a story gets repeated with enough conviction, it becomes true by default. That grief, once performed, doesn't get cross-examined. But a missing 4-year-old girl doesn't just generate sympathy. It generates a machine search grids, timeline reconstruction, interview after interview, digital forensics, pulling apart phone records and location data down to the minute. And machines like that don't care how convincingly you cry in front of a camera. The timeline was the first thing to crack. Investigators don't just take a last seen time at face value. They build a minute-by-minute reconstruction and then test it against everything else. Phone pings, neighbor accounts, home surveillance if it exists, even the physical layout of a property and how plausible it actually is for a 4-year-old to wander unnoticed for 45 minutes in the specific spot described. Every detail in Herring's account was a thread, and investigators spent 4 days pulling on every single one of them. At the same time, agents were doing something else entirely. They were looking backward, not forward. Not just where did Javeayah go on June 30th, but what was actually happening in this household in the weeks before June 30th. That's a completely different investigative track, and it's the one that ultimately broke the case open. Because a search for a missing child assumes the child was, at some point recently, alive and present. Once investigators started examining evidence suggesting otherwise, evidence pointing to an injury, to a lack of any medical record, to inconsistencies in when people had actually last seen Javeayah alive, the entire premise of the search shifted underneath everyone's feet. By July 3rd, something had changed. Ground search efforts were scaled back. If you've watched enough of these cases, you know what that particular detail usually signals. Not that hope is fading in some abstract sense, but that investigators' focus has moved. And it had. It had moved from the woods and back towards that house near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, and toward the 2 people who lived in it. On July 4th, Sheriff Sawyer called a press conference, and what he said next is the kind of statement that changes a case's entire genre in a single sentence. He told reporters this was the hardest announcement of his 36-year career in law enforcement. He said the evidence led investigators to believe Javeayah Harris was deceased and not recently. His words were that she'd likely been dead for at least a month, meaning that on the night Herring made that 911 call, on the night hundreds of people dropped what they were doing to search wooded terrain in the South Carolina heat, there was, according to Sawyer, nothing left to find. It was already too late to save her the moment the 911 call came in. He said, "Sit with the cruelty embedded in that sentence for a second. Every hour of that search, every dog, every drone, every agent pulled off other cases had been spent looking for a little girl who authorities believe was already gone before anyone even dialed 911. And then came the arrests. Johmarea Harris, 23, taken into custody and charged with homicide by child abuse. Michilae Herring, 22, charged with the same offense plus one more charge stacked on top of it, filing false police report. That second charge might sound almost like an afterthought next to homicide, but it's not. It's the legal system's way of naming exactly what that 911 call was. Not a grieving mother reporting a tragedy, but according to prosecutors, the opening act of a cover-up. Both were denied bond at separate hearings the following day, July 5th. And this is where warrants revealed the detail that turned an already devastating case into something even harder to process. Both parents, according to investigators, had confessed, not just to the false report, to what actually happened to Javeayah, to the injury, to the failure to seek help, to what they did with her afterward in a location authorities say sits outside Aiken County entirely, with search efforts subsequently shifting toward Fairfield and Chester counties. Here's the question that should be sitting in your chest right now, heading into what comes next. How do 2 people sit through days of a manhunt they know is pointless? Watch strangers cry over their daughter's disappearance, accept condolences for a lie, and then, when finally confronted, just confess? What actually breaks first in a situation like that? The evidence or the person? When Sheriff Marty Sawyer described those confessions, he used a phrase that stuck with a lot of people who followed this case. He said the parents' actions showed extreme indifference to human life. That's not just a colorful quote for a press conference. That phrase carries legal weight. Under South Carolina law, homicide by child abuse doesn't require prosecutors to prove intent to kill. It requires showing that a child died as a result of abuse or as a result of extreme indifference to the child's life, meaning a caregiver who knew a child was in serious danger and chose deliberately not to act. That's precisely the theory investigators appear to be building this case on. Not that Javeayah Harris and Michilae Herring set out that day to end their daughter's life. That an injury happened, that it went untreated for reasons only they may ever fully explain, and that the choice not to seek help was made with a level of knowing disregard the law treats as functionally equal to intent. So what does that actually mean for the two of them going forward? Homicide by child abuse in South Carolina carries a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. That's not a range prosecutors have full discretion to work down from. In some minor plea deal, it's a mandatory minimum, which tells you how seriously the state treats cases where a caregiver is the one responsible for a child's death. On top of that, Herring faces the separate charge of filing a false police report, which on its own carries up to 5 years and a $5,000 fine. Stack those together, and you're looking at two people whose combined legal exposure runs from 2 decades at the absolute minimum up to the rest of their lives, depending on how the case proceeds. And investigators have already said additional charges may still be coming as the investigation continues. As of the most recent updates, neither Harris nor Herring has gone to trial. Both were denied bond at their initial hearings, meaning they're sitting in custody while the case builds toward whatever comes next, likely a formal indictment, followed by the long, grinding process that any homicide case involving confessions and forensic evidence tends to follow. Confessions carry enormous weight in the eyes of a jury, but they don't end a case on their own. Prosecutors will still need to corroborate what Harris and Herring told investigators with physical evidence, which is part of why the search for Javeayah's body hadn't concluded even after the arrests were made. Sheriff Sawyer was explicit about that in his July 4th statement. The search for Javeayah drives on. Recovering her remains isn't just about giving her family somewhere to grieve, though that alone would justify it. It's about giving prosecutors the forensic backbone a confession. Alone can't fully provide cause of death, timeline confirmation, physical corroboration of exactly what these two people say happened. And that's the state this case sits in right now. 2 confessed parents, a mandatory sentencing range waiting on the other side of a trial that hasn't happened yet, and a little girl whose body, as far as public reporting shows, still hadn't been recovered from wherever her parents chose to leave her, somewhere outside the county she was born and raised in. Now here's where I want to leave you, because this is the part of the story that I think says more about human nature than anything else in this case. 200 people searched for Javeayah Harris. A helicopter flew grid patterns over Aiken County. Drones mapped terrain too dense to walk. Dogs trained specifically to locate remains worked property lines and tree lines for days. FBI agents pulled specialized units, usually reserved for the most serious child abduction cases in the country, off other assignments, and put them entirely on this one. Local, state, and federal resources, all converging on a single objective: bring this little girl home safely. And the entire time, the 2 people who set that machine in motion knew exactly why it would never succeed. That's the irony sitting at the center of this story, and it's not a small one. Every dollar spent, every hour donated by volunteer fire departments, every agent pulled from other active cases, every ounce of a community's hope, all of it was generated by a lie 2 people told specifically because they understood how effectively grief mobilizes people. They knew a missing child story would bring hundreds of strangers to their county within hours. They were counting on it, and for 4 days it worked exactly as intended. But here's what they didn't seem to understand, or maybe just didn't care to think through. The same machine built to find a missing child doesn't just look outward into the woods. It looks inward, at the people who reported her gone. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit doesn't just search terrain, it studies stories, timelines, inconsistencies, the tiny cracks that show up when a narrative is being performed rather than lived. Every single resource Harris and Herring's lie summoned to Aiken County ultimately became the instrument of their undoing. The search that was supposed to protect their story instead dismantled it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to stand on but a confession. Sheriff Sawyer called it the hardest announcement of his 36-year career. Special Agent Kevin Moore called it heartbreaking that they weren't standing there with better news. Both of those men meant what they said. But somewhere underneath the heartbreak sits a colder, harder truth about this case, that the very lie designed to protect two people from consequence is the exact thing that guaranteed they'd face it. Javeayah Harris didn't get saved by that search. But in a strange, bitter way, she got justice from it. The machine her parents built to hide what happened to her ended up being the one that found them instead. What's your take about this case, my people?